Well, let's get into some of these draft myths, right? Like obviously everybody's an expert, right? And everybody has what works for them and what doesn't. But I want to talk to you about some that I've heard and some that float around typically around this time too, right around training camp, preseason, before week one actually hits, and then nobody really knows anything, right? One of the things is that camp, right? Training camp is where we find all the information. So I want to ask you, Kendall, when it comes to camp hype, when we get Mike Davis has big legs and Calvin Ridley is running faster than anybody, Marvin Harrison is swole and ready to go now, how much do you lean into the camp hype?
I love a good camp hype video. I'll tell you that right now. When I see like JSN going up, I think that was a couple years ago, I was like, I love this man. And same thing with other players. So I love a camp hype video. I will say, we've been either tipped their hand a little bit or we've been burned. Like, remember when Jamar Chase was coming out and they said he had drops issues? And then seriously, right after that, his ADP, it went down because people were very worried about Jamar Chase, and look at what has happened right now. So I think you can buy in. I think, Coach Speak and Coach Speak Index is a really good, if you guys don't follow on Twitter, that's a really fun account to follow because it's really going through what coaches say and how much of the time they actually mean it. We know Pete Carroll is never good with an injury update. He doesn't even know what's going on. Same with Zach Taylor for the Bengals. He really messed up a lot of fantasy people's weeks when it was T Higgins and we didn't know if he was going to play or not. So in regards to camp, I listen and then I take it with a grain of salt. I do think, though, this season especially, that there are training camp battles that I want to watch it and I want to read all of the quotes on them because I want to know what could really go on. Because, Daniel Jones could actually be the starter for the Indianapolis Colts. I'm just here to say it. I want to read about especially injury reports during training camp. I want to make sure that I'm on top of those. So long way to answer your question is I pay attention, but I also take everything with a grain of salt. And it just takes time to go through all the quotes. Don't read the short quotes that are only, this big. There's probably a lot more that was said in those. I think that's the more important part is you can get the transcripts. You can see the whole thing when they go live after training camps. They'll do a whole press conference live. So it's just making sure you do your due diligence because we're all getting the same information. But it's just kind of going out and seeking all of the information I think is important.
Yeah, because we know that headlines can be made out of a single clip. And a lot of times they don't give the full context of a question. So I love reading the pressers, and even those coaches lie and they know how to talk to the media and get out of questions. So it's at some point, Kendall, it's we have to know, okay, take that part, you can use it, but don't lean so far into it that it disrupts the flow of how you draft players.
And I think you have to be really don't overreact so quickly. It's just if you hear something on a Monday, things change so fast. They could just say, oh, actually, Roschon Johnson, it's going to be a 1A, 1B situation. Don't immediately go into your draft, an underdog draft, and be well, I'm going to now not only not draft Swift, I'm now going to only draft Roschon Johnson and Managi or whoever the third running back is there that they drafted. Just take it and just sit on it for a couple weeks because usually unless it's an injury, they really don't know yet.
Yeah, I feel like that happens all the time. Bijan, I remember one year Bijan, shout out to you know what I'm saying, but that's my number one player, by the way. He was falling that first year because he's third on the depth chart, right? You remember that report? He's third on the depth chart. Last year it was Kyron Williams. We're going to have him returning punts. So I think there's wild things that come out that don't typically align with where we initially have the value. But then if you see camp tape and you're a player that I maybe was down on, the beat writers love, and he's showing a lot of signs in training camp. Last year, that player was Brian Thomas. There was a lot of excitement about Brian Thomas. You talked about how you liked him, but he was way down there in the rankings. You could have got him as your wide receiver 4, and there was talk that he was the wide receiver 1, and he looked the part. So I don't lean into everything, but I will listen to the training camp, the pressers. Last year, John Harbaugh said, hey, Rashad Bateman's one of our guys. He's going to be our lead receiver. And what happened? Sure enough, he was the lead guy. So it's one of those things where you don't want to lean so far into it, but that makes all your decisions. But on the flip side, it's I don't know. There might be some credence to some of the things they say.
Absolutely. 100%.
What about this, right? A lot of people debate whether it's floor or it's upside, right? You have to draft upside to win your leagues because fantasy championships are only won in week 15 and 17. So you want the highest possible lineup. And then you got the people who are like, well, you got to draft floor. You know, you got to make it there first. You got to make it to the playoffs. You hear the two sides of this conversation, Kendall, a lot, right? You hear you got to draft for floor, you got to draft for upside. Which one do you lean into more as you draft your teams?
I think that's a really good question. But I think, once we get into the later rounds and I'm looking at, maybe some rookies, I am looking for upside because, when you hit on the late, and it's really those later rounds, because you kind of know the floor that you're getting with your first round Bijan Robinsons or your, second round Trey McBrides. Like, what they can bring to your team. But it is true that it is nice when you can hit on players that are later, like Tyrone Tracy last year, or even Chase Brown last year was someone that I really loved, that it was like he was going way too late. Even like honestly, Jaden Daniels last season was going too late for any of our likings. Like he was at some point going as the QB 12, QB 10, and it's one of those things where you say, I want to hit on this guy because if he's going this late, I know that I can get really, really solid players in the first half of my draft. So I think it's a little bit of both, but upside with rookies especially, I think is always really interesting, and not just rookies. It's with everyone, but just kind of following, like we said, following not only like camp hype and stuff, but just how these depth charts could shake out. So for me, especially with rookies, though, the one piece of advice that I always give for the last couple of years is like, if you draft a rookie and you are excited about him, you're going to have to be patient. And so some of these rookies that could pay off later, the week 14 on, it's because the rookies usually don't do as well. Typically, the later round rookies don't do as well at the beginning of the season. They're getting acclimated. Yep. Maybe they don't have the target share that you would necessarily want, but you waiting and being patient. And sometimes we don't have the luxury, right? Sometimes you have injuries like Christian McCaffrey, and you're just going to have to say, I have to get rid of X player because I just can't wait for their breakout. But for me, those later round guys, especially, some of the rookies or the guys just buried on depth charts where they could have a chance this season, I do try to shoot for the upside there but again, you have to be really patient with them.
I'm not mad at that. And you know what? It's one of those things where it's a nice balance, right? I think upside is how you win your league, though. And a lot of people want to draft safe, especially like if you ever do auction leagues, you notice that there's some people who spend all their money super early. And then there's some people who like wait all the way until like the middle rounds and they start spending money. Well, a lot of times that limits your upside and your ability to win a league. And when you go for the safe players, a lot of times you miss out on potential league winning upside down the stretch. The part that gets me is I think in the early rounds, I think there is a method to like having a nice floor, taking on a lot of injury or maybe drafting players from the same team early. It leaves you a little vulnerable on a week-to-week basis. Whereas I think getting your upside maybe a little bit later, you talked about it with the rookies, but even players like a Justin Fields or somebody that may not hurt you if you draft them, or you can pair somebody up that's probably very similar production-wise, but with the safer floor. I find a lot of value in that. And I think that is how you win your leagues, is by smashing. If you can get that 15th, 16th round pick, the 13th round pick, and they potentially like a top 10 to 15 at their position, like to me, that's how you win your league, like straight up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things where you're going to be wrong sometimes. Like we try and like those quarterbacks where if I say I don't want an elite quarterback I don't want to spend that price at the beginning. I also don't want, the weird middle, Bo Nix, Kyler Murray, Patrick Mahomes. Like I don't want someone in the 8, 9, 10 range. And you wait, like if you waited and you drafted Baker Mayfield last season, he won you your league, like just straight up. And that's what we talk about shooting for upside. It's like the path is there. It's all laid out. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So, but taking the shots on those guys and then realizing when to get out. Like if you drafted CJ Stroud last season and he was like the 5th, 6th quarterback off the board, it's so important. Like this is another piece of advice. I know it's really difficult when you spend up, when you pay a lot and the ADP is way up there, it's really hard to drop these players. But if you continued on with CJ Stroud, like even Deebo Samuel at times, they probably cost you and hurt you. And it's really tough when you pay up for those guys. But sometimes you just have to know when to jump ship. And those were 2 players that we got a lot of calls on Sirius XM is like, what should I do with CJ Stroud? And at some point we were like, if you have bench depth, you can put him on your bench forever, or you can drop them and try and go out on the waiver wire and just stream.
It's hard. It's hard because they're talented players and they're probably struggling, going through an injury or just in a slump. And that is one of the things. It's just you have to know, like sometimes it's hard. Mark Andrews was another player last year and sometimes the bounce back happens. And you're like, you kind of miss out on that. So it's I would say it's delicate, because sometimes you throw away players and it works out. Other times you don't. But at the end of the day, what matters? Your record matters. Getting to the playoffs and winning your fantasy championship matters. So I think, to me, that's the floor upside thing. It's, you got to know, if you draft somebody and their floor is low, at some point you may have to get rid of them.
Exactly.
What about playoff matchups? Like, there's a lot of people that rush to week 15, 16, 17. I know it's like that in best ball especially, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of people rush to the fantasy playoffs. And I'm a person who does like to look ahead, because sometimes that matters, right? But strength of schedule, it changes throughout the year, because some teams have injuries. Maybe teams aren't as good as we expected. Some are better than we expected. How are you when it comes to playoff matchups? Is that something you take into account when you draft? Or are you like, I could wait until a little bit later on that?
I think I'd take, from week 15, like you said, 15, 16, 17 for most. On Underdog, I do correlate. I will say that straight up. But Underdog is so different that if you're playing on Underdog, you kind of know that, because you need to beat thousands upon thousands of people to win some of that money. And so I do correlate for the playoffs in best ball. But if we're talking just regular redraft, I take a peek. I will say I'll take a peek. Like, one great example that I remember from last year was that I loved drafting Joe Mixon, but I knew down the stretch that they had a really tough fantasy playoff schedule. And what happened to Joe Mixon? He was not good in the playoffs down the stretch. Yeah. So I keep it in mind. I don't usually like to let, bye weeks or that kind of stuff really, really infiltrate my draft strategy. And it's in the back of my mind where I say, okay, I need to make sure that, I don't have these two quarterbacks on the same bye week or something. I want to avoid bye-mageddon at all costs, so I don't lose that week. But if we're talking Underdog, I definitely correlate. And then for just regular redraft, I do like to look at just defensive matchups, especially with more with my running backs than anything else, especially if Joe Mixon was a year older. I was like, okay, how's he actually going to do down the back half of the stretch? Because that's sometimes where we see them tail off a little bit. Unless you're Derrick Henry, then it just nothing even freaking matters for you, and he's going to be fine until he decides to quit. But I do take a little bit into account, but I don't, like I said, I don't let it take over my draft strategy much.
Yeah, it's one of those things, because we heard it last year. Bijan has a soft schedule down the stretch. Detroit has a soft schedule down the stretch. And then we saw Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan go crazy in that time period. But it was also it's also a culmination of other things. You get a rookie quarterback in there, so things change there.
Exactly.
Dave Montgomery got hurt. Things changed there. So I think there's a lot of things that play into it. For me, when I look at playoff matchups, I use it as hey, if I'm deciding between one or two players, now I'm going to look at playoff matchup and think, okay, maybe they have a bad matchup. When I will start to really look at playoff matchups, though, is about week 4, week 3, when I know, okay, I know how teams are playing now. I have a better gauge as to this offensive line looks way better than we thought, or maybe this defense is giving up a lot of points to the running back, more so than we ever thought. Mm-hmm. It's now I can go target those players in trades. So I tend to look at playoff matchups a little bit after the draft, for better or for worse. But for me,
I like that.
I'm not really looking at schedules until probably a little bit later, because strength of schedule is one thing, but oftentimes that changes throughout the year, at least from what I found.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the Giants with the worst schedule, worst strength of schedule, the hardest strength of schedule, I should say. But then tied for second is the Lions. And so I love when people talk about the Lions and then Jared Goff, and he's got 7 outdoor games. And I'm like, okay, but last year he was able to totally that didn't even matter to him. But it is something that people look at, I will say. And especially down the stretch too, when looking at schedules, I'll make sure that I've got the right, this is thinking way ahead. But that's when you find the right handcuffs too. If you took an Isaac Guerrero last season, it was really important. And so for me, just looking, if someone looks like they're getting a ton of work in the first 3 or 4 weeks, you're like, okay, just in case they wear down a little bit, I want to make sure I have the right backups.
Right.